Hello and welcome to Train Signal. This is video number 2, installation of ISA Server 2004. Here's our table of contents for this video. We'll start off by covering the scenario with the Blue Crab Food Company, why it is that we're installing ISA Server, the importance of planning, and we'll perform planning for the Blue Crab Food Company. We'll go over installation best practices. We'll configure the network interfaces on the ISA server, and then we'll install ISA Server 2004. Let's take a look at our scenario. Before installing ISA Server on any network, proper planning must be done. The ISA Server will be a central point of control between your network and other networks. ISA can control who gains access to external networks and what they can do. It can control what traffic comes in and to where. Additionally, ISA Server can act as a VPN server, and because of its importance, many uses, and interaction with other critical network systems, ISA needs to be installed right the first time. Before installing ISA, let's plan out our installation at the Blue Crab Food Company. So, a big part of planning is asking the right questions. So let's go through some planning questions here. Here are the types of questions you should be asking yourself when planning the installation of ISA Server. First off, what's the purpose of installing ISA Server? What do you plan to use it for? You could just plan to use it as a stateful firewall to protect your network. With that, you wouldn't have to involve Active Directory, VPN. You wouldn't have to do any publishing rules if you're just protecting your network from the internet, let's say. If you want to use all the different features of ISA, you're going to have to do some more planning, some additional planning, because ISA has to fit in with other critical systems in your network. What features will you use and how will you use them? So we talked about that. That plays an important role in the different settings you'll need to configure with ISA and how simple or how complex your installation of ISA will be. How many servers will you need? Say you have a small company. Most likely you just need one server at your single office. Say you have 100 offices. You might consider putting a single ISA server at every office. In that case, you need 100 servers. Say you have a large corporate office with 1,000 users. Maybe a single ISA server cannot handle the volume of web requests that ISA server will need to. So maybe you need an array or multiple ISA servers to handle that volume. So how many servers will you need? Where will you place them? If you have 100 sites, you could just put one server at the central office and all the remote users could come back to the central office, go through the ISA server, then go out to the internet. Or you could put an ISA server at every remote office. Really, it depends on whether the remote offices have internet access. It depends how many users are out at those remote offices and how much network complexity you're willing to take on and trade that off with performance, let's say. So how will ISA integrate into the existing network? Well, if you're starting brand new, you don't have to worry about that a lot. You look at what other servers you have and ISA is going to fit in. But say you have existing proxy servers, or say you have multiple existing stateful firewalls and you're going to use ISA just as a VPN server or just as a caching server or just to do user authentication and logging. You have to think about all these different things before you put in an ISA server into an existing network. What is your security policy and how does ISA fit into that? So every company should have a security policy that defines exactly what methods you're going to use to secure your network, what can users do, how can they do it, when can they do it, what's the business reason in them being able to do that on the network. This security policy should be your framework for every security device you have at your company, and that includes ISA. So how does ISA fit into your security policy is an important question to ask. What are the hardware requirements of the server? So we talked about, how many servers will you need? Well, how many processors will you need on each server? How much RAM, how much hardware, or how much hard disk? Microsoft has published specifications on that. In the case of the Blue Crab Food Company, we're just going to have a single processor server with an average amount of RAM for a server, say 512 megabytes of RAM, and 80 gig hard drive is more than plenty. Today, an average server would be just fine to carry the load for a small company using ISA. But if you have a large company with 1,000 users or so, you need to look at, okay, I might need a dual processor server with a gig of RAM, and is that even going to be enough? Will you provide fault tolerance or servers at branch offices? So if you just have one server and that server goes down, is that going to be acceptable to your users? Or do you need to have redundant servers somehow? Will you publish servers behind the ISA server? So if you have an email server and a web server that need to be accessed from the internet, will you put those behind the ISA server and have ISA publish those services out to the internet? So when users come in, first they would connect to the ISA server, then they connect to the mail server or the web server. So ISA is protecting those servers from the internet. Will you use ISA as a VPN server? So you could have someone out on the internet with a laptop connect with the VPN client in Windows back to your ISA server and get on your private network. Will you be doing that? ISA also can act as a site-to-site VPN server. So you could even use ISA, say you had 100 sites, you could put an ISA server at every site, say every site has an internet connection. You could connect all those sites back to a corporate office, or you could fully mesh those sites. You could connect one site to every other site, and you could use ISA to do this, to tunnel and encrypt that traffic as it goes through the internet between those sites. So you could use ISA server to create a site-to-site VPN network. Just another possibility, another way to use ISA server. Will clients use ISA as a web proxy? Are you going to enable a web proxy on every one of your PCs? Are you going to install the firewall client? Or are you just going to use Secure NAT? And we'll talk about those. But these are all things you need to read up on and look into before deploying an ISA server onto a company's network. And how will you resolve DNS names? Usually people have an internal DNS server that would do DNS forwarding, and that's how we're configuring things for the Blue Crab Food Company. But other companies have different scenarios. Maybe they have an existing DNS infrastructure, and ISA has to fit into that somehow. So these are just a list of questions that you need to ask before you go about deploying ISA. Now, at the Blue Crab Food Company, we know our purpose. Blue Crab Food Company has a new office. The ISA server is going to be there at that new office. We're going to use authentication and logging of web requests. We're going to use the firewall client. We're going to use web proxy. We're just going to have one server. We're just going to place that one server at that one office. It's not going to integrate very much with an existing network because really the network's brand new. There's going to be an Active Directory domain controller and the ISA server, and that's really the only infrastructure right now at the Blue Crab Food Company. The security policy, we're going to get into that when we configure firewall rules in some of the upcoming videos. Hardware requirements, just a single processor, no fault tolerance, no remote branch offices. We will be publishing servers. We're going to publish a mail server and a web server for the Blue Crab Food Company behind the ISA server. We're going to enable VPN client connections, and we're going to test that out, show you how to configure that. And we will be using it as a web proxy, and we're going to demonstrate how you can create users in Active Directory, and then when those users make web requests, actually log the user that made the request, what site they went to, when they went there, and then create reports based on that. And then for DNS, like I said, we're going to use a DNS forwarder. So let's move on to best practices. So here's some ISA server best practices. You should install ISA on a server not connected to the internet to start off with. So first you have this new server, you're going to make it your ISA server, you put the CD in there. At that point, when you're installing ISA, before you secure that server with ISA, that server shouldn't be connected to the internet. That's because that server could get infected with a virus or a worm before you install the firewall on it and protect it. So you don't want to corrupt your firewall before you make it into a firewall and secure it. Do not connect to the internet with the ISA machine once it's installed. So once you have ISA running on there, you don't want to go and bring up Internet Explorer and start surfing the internet. That's because that machine, again, could get a virus or a worm or whatever, download some malicious program unbeknownst to you while you're surfing the internet. Only use the ISA server for ISA. So don't make the ISA server a file server or domain controller, some other use. If you're going to run ISA for a company, just make the ISA server only running ISA. Configure network interfaces before installing. And that's exactly what we're going to do in this video. Is we're going to be configuring our network interfaces, and then we're going to install a ISA. Patch the operating system before installing ISA. And that's what we've done. We've installed Windows 2003 Service Pack 1 and all the applicable patches or the current patches from Microsoft on this server before installing ISA on it. And that's what you should do as well. Only define a default gateway on the outside interface. So the only default gateway should be on the outside interface. The inside interface won't have a default gateway. And that default gateway has to be on the outside interface because that outside interface is going to talk to the router, the upstream router, and that router is going to send that request off to the internet. So that's where you put your default gateways, on the outside. Only define a DNS server on the inside interface to the internal DNS server. Now there are a few other ways of doing this, but in this series of videos, this is how we have it configured, and this is probably the easiest and simplest way to do this, is to have an internal DNS server. That DNS server is has a forwarder configured, so it's sending requests out to those real internet ISP DNS servers. So you just have one internal DNS server, all the clients point to that DNS server, and then on the ISA server you have a DNS server configured, but only on the inside interface. None of the other interfaces have DNS configured. So those are some ISA server best practices that you should be aware of. Let's move on and look at our network diagram. Here's our diagram at the Blue Crab Food Company. First, let's just look at the server that we'll be configuring. Now that server is the ISA server right here, and this is where we'll spend most of our time in this series of videos, configuring this ISA server. Notice that this ISA server on the inside, also called the internal interface, connects to the inside network or the private network. This would be your LAN in here, or your company's LAN. In this case, it's the Blue Crab Food Company's local area network. So down here is a switch. Then if we scroll down, here's our domain controller called DC, and here's our client called Client 1. So all these devices down here, these hosts, connect to this switch, which connects to the ISA server. So this is the network we want to protect. Over here on the right is called the DMZ. Now right now we don't have hosts over here on this DMZ, but the Blue Crab Food Company is planning to put hosts over there, an Exchange SMTP server and a web server. And here's the planned IP addresses for those. So those are connected to a switch which is connected to the DMZ interface of the ISA server. And then notice that's a 172.16 network, 172.16.1.0 network over here, and the IP address for the DMZ interface is 172.16.1.1. Up here on the top of the ISA server, this is the outside interface, also called the external interface. Notice the IP address on this is 1.1.1.1. So this would be a public IP out here on this interface. In the case of the Blue Crab Food Company, this IP is 1.1.1.1. Their inside of their router right here is 1.1.1.2. So this is the external interface of the ISA server. This is the internal interface, and this will be the DMZ interface over here, which is also called a perimeter network. So this is what we'll be configuring. Now we've already configured the internal interface here. We've already configured the IP address on that. We're about to configure the DMZ and the outside interfaces. So with that, let's go ahead and get on with the configuration of those outside interfaces. Now we can configure the network interfaces on our ISA server. To do that, I'm going to minimize our notes. I'm going to go over here to Remote Desktop and open Remote Desktop. I'm going to use Remote Desktop to connect to the ISA server, isa.bluecrabfood.com. I'll log on as the domain administrator. And the first thing we need to do is go and open our network interfaces. So we'll go to Start, Control Panel, and I'm going to double click on the network connections. So here's our three different interfaces: Local Area Connection 2, Local Area Connection, and Local Area Connection 3. Now, the first connection here, Local Area Connection, this one is actually our internal interface. And if I double click on it, you can tell it's connected, it's sending and receiving traffic. If I click on support, I can see this is 192.168.1.10. So this is our internal interface, it's already configured, and this is our internal LAN. We've got these two other interfaces here, 2 and 3. One of them is going to be our DMZ interface, and the other will be our external interface connecting to a router going to the internet. As these names here are kind of confusing, what we need to do is rename these. So I'm going to right click on this, say rename. I'm going to call this internal. And then of these other two here, I'm just going to pick one. I'm going to call this one DMZ. And I'll call this one external. Okay, now we've named our interfaces. We know which one is which. And that's going to help us a lot in configuring and installing ISA. The next thing we need to do is to reorder these adapters. To do that, I'm going to go up to Advanced and go to Advanced Settings. And then let's look at the Adapters and Bridges, or Adapters and Bindings section right here under Connections. And right now the order of connections is DMZ External Internal. Now it says connections are listed in the order in which they are accessed by network services. So what we want to do is put them in the order of internal, DMZ, then external. And that way the internal adapter is accessed first for network services. So I'm going to move internal up to the top. Then DMZ is second, then external is third. And that's how we want it right there. And then if we look down here, bindings for internal, that's fine. Client from Microsoft Networks, file and print sharing. For DMZ, we don't need either one of these. I'm going to uncheck both of those. And for external, I'm going to uncheck both of those as well. Those adapters are facing unsecured networks, and we don't want services like this installed on those. So with that, we're done there. I'm going to say OK. Our next task is we need to set the IP address configuration for these adapters. So let's start off with the external interface. I'm going to right click on it, say Properties. Notice that the client from Microsoft Networks and the file and print sharing are unchecked here. That's due to our previous configuration we did under the advanced settings. Let's double check, or let's go in and configure the Internet Protocol TCP/IP here. I'm going to double click on that. We're going to statically assign an IP address per our network diagram. It will be 1.1.1.1 with a class C mask. The default gateway will be 1.1.1.2, and then we won't be configuring any DNS on this. Remember, you only have a single DNS address on the entire server. Let's click on Advanced. The IP settings are fine here. Let's go to DNS, and for the external and DMZ interfaces both, make sure you uncheck this, register this connection's addresses in DNS. We don't need that. Let's go to WINS. Make sure that the Enable LM Host Lookup is unchecked, and we're going to disable NetBIOS over TCP/IP. Say OK, and say OK there. For authentication, I'm just going to uncheck that. Enable IEEE 802.1x, and for Windows Firewall, it says that it cannot be run because it's not installed, or it's not started. The Windows Firewall ICS service is not started. I'm just going to say no because we don't want that. I just want to make sure it wasn't running or it wasn't enabled. So we're all done configuring the external interface. I'll say OK. Now we're going to configure the same settings on the DMZ interface, but with different IP addresses, of course. So let's go in here to Internet Protocol, We'll set the IP address, Class C subnet mask. Oh, and there's no default gateway on the DMZ interface. Also, there's no DNS servers. So I'm going to go into Advanced DNS. I'm going to uncheck this, register this connection's addresses in DNS. We don't need that. I'm going to go to WINS, make sure this is unchecked, and I'm going to disable NetBIOS over TCP/IP. Say OK. Say OK here. And we're done configuring our network interfaces on the ISA server. Let's make sure that our external interface here, facing the internet, can communicate with our upstream router that connects to our internet service provider. So I'm going to go to Start, Command Prompt, and I'm going to ping our default gateway. And we do get a reply from our default gateway. This is our router that connects to the internet. That way we know we have good internet connectivity before we start any of the other exercises. So I'm going to exit out of there. I'll close this window. And here we are back at our notes. Our next task is to install and configure our ISA Server 2004. So to do that, I'm going to go back here to the Blue Crab Food Company ISA server. And I've already downloaded and put on a CD the demo installation files for ISA Server 2004 Standard. So I've got that CD in the drive. I'm going to go to Start, go to My Computer, and here's my CD right here. I'm going to double click on that. And this file right here is the ISA Server 2004 eval standard is what the S is for right there. 46 megabytes. I'm going to run that. Double click on it. It says you're about to extract this to C:. I'll say yes. Now this will take just a minute here, and while it's extracting, let's talk about what we're going to be doing in this process. When you install ISA Server, it asks you a few questions about your network interfaces, and that's exactly why we just got done configuring our network interfaces properly. And that way, when it asks us about our network interfaces, we can say this one's on the outside, or the external, this one's on the DMZ, and this other interface is on the internal network. We don't have to configure the IP addresses or tell it what they are. We just tell it the interface. So everything on that interface it knows is external. Everything on this other interface is DMZ. Everything on the other face is our internal private network. So we're done extracting. This is the installation window here. So we could read the Get Starting Guide, Migration Guide, Migration Wizard, Release Notes. What we're going to do though right now is install ISA Server 2004. So I'm going to click on that. It says Welcome to ISA Server 2004. I'm going to say Next. I will accept the terms of the license agreement and say Next. It asks for my name. It's got a evaluation serial number in here. I'm going to put in organization as bluecrabfood.com and say Next. I'm just going to take the typical installation. That should work just fine for the Blue Crab Food Company. Of course, you could customize or do a complete installation. We'll say Next. Now here it asks us, what is the internal network? Which network interface or which network address range will be the internal network? So I'm going to say Add. And instead of typing in a range here, I'm going to say Select Network Adapter. That's going to be the easiest thing for us to do. So our network adapter for the internal network is, hey, fancy that, it's named right here already, internal. So I'll check that. We're going to uncheck to add the following private IP address ranges because we're using these IP address ranges for, or at least one of them, for our DMZ and for our internal. So we don't want to confuse anything. We're just going to uncheck that, and we're going to add the internal network as our internal network. So it says the internal network was defined based on the Windows routing table. So Basically, if this adapter was misconfigured or the routing table was misconfigured, then ISA server will be misconfigured as well. So from the IP address on our internal adapter, it put in this range of IP addresses here. And it's going to say that any IP in this range is going to be on our internal private network. So that's correct. We'll say OK. It filled it in here for us, and I'm going to say next. Now it says when you click next, setup will configure ISA server to allow remote management from IP address 192.168.1.13. That happens to be the IP address that I'm connecting to this server from. So that'll be fine. We'll take that as the default. Okay, do we want to allow computers running earlier versions of the firewall client software to connect? Sure, that's fine. We'll go ahead and take that. It really doesn't make that much of a difference. We'll say next. It says if these services are running on this computer, then they must be stopped. IS and SNMP. Those are not running on this computer, so it shouldn't have to stop them. But it also points out that it will disable for us the Internet Connection Firewall or IP network address translation on this server, which is good. So we don't have to worry about the Windows firewall, conflicting with the ISA server. It's going to disable that for us automatically. So I'll say next. Now we're ready to begin installation. So I'll say next, and installation will begin. Now this is going to take several minutes, so I'm going to pause the video while it's doing that, and when it's done it's going to say installation's complete, let's reboot. I'll reboot, and then when we come back to the video, the ISA server will have rebooted. So let me minimize this, and we'll pause the video for just a second. Okay, we're back. The installation of ISA Server 2004 completed, and when it was done, I went ahead and rebooted the ISA server just to be safe. So now let's go back to the ISA server. I've already logged in, and ISA server is actually installed. We can go to Start, and we can go to All Programs, Microsoft ISA Server, and the ISA Server Management Console right here. And there we go. It's already installed. Click on ISA. Here's our Getting Started. What we need to do next, though, before we start using ISA, is apply ISA Server 2004 Service Pack 1. So I'm going to close this out, go to Start, My Computer, and go back to that CD. And on the CD, I've copied ISA Server 2004 Service Pack 1 right here. So I'm going to double-click on that and run it. And then after installing ISA Server 2004 Service Pack 1, the installation will be complete. So I'm going to say next, accept the license agreement, and click Update. And that's really all there is to installing the service pack. So it's going to stop the services, copy over some files, and fix all the holes in the regular ISA server, apply the service pack, and then after that I'm going to go ahead and reboot the server and bring ISA back up and log in, and then we'll be ready to start our next video. So for now I'm just going to minimize this, and let's go back here to our slides and conclude our video. So in conclusion, we learned the importance of planning and the right questions to ask when installing a new ISA server. We learned about ISA Server 2004 best practices, like naming your network interfaces and configuring those prior to installing ISA. We learned about where to put a default gateway on an ISA server and where to put a DNS server, and some important network settings when configuring your network adapters. We configured our network interfaces, and you saw how to do that. Then we installed ISA Server 2004, and then we're now applying ISA Server 2004 Service Pack 1. This concludes the video. I hope you learned a lot, and I look forward to the next video. Thank you.